I was a nurse fired for negligence until I exposed the hospital's fake medical records. But that morning, standing in Director Walsh's office with my termination papers trembling in my hands, I had no idea that the very lie they used to destroy me would become the weapon I'd use to bring them all down. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Walsh's cold gray eyes studied my face for any sign of weakness. His fingers drummed against the mahogany desk, each tap a calculated reminder of his power. The manila folder containing my supposed infractions sat open between us, its contents a carefully constructed narrative of my professional downfall. Patient medication errors, failure to follow protocol, negligent documentation. Each accusation felt like a blade sliding between my ribs, but it was the finality in Walsh's expression that cut deepest. He had already decided. This meeting was theater, not justice. My hands remained steady as I signed the acknowledgement forms, though every instinct screamed to fight back. 23 years of service, countless lives saved, families comforted in their darkest hours, all reduced to a stack of fabricated complaints and conveniently timed incident reports. The security guard waited by the door, his presence making it clear that my escort from the building would be immediate and public. Walsh's secretary had already boxed my personal items, the cardboard container sitting like a small coffin on the chair beside me. I walked through those familiar corridors one final time, past the nurses' station where my colleagues averted their eyes, past the break room where I'd spent countless hours mentoring younger staff, past the supply closet where I'd stored the evidence that would have saved my career, if only I'd known to look for it then. The parking garage swallowed me in its concrete embrace, and I sat in my car for 30 minutes, letting the rage crystallize into something harder, more focused. They had played this game before. The timing was too perfect, the documentation too thorough, the witnesses too rehearsed, but they had made one critical error. They had assumed I would disappear quietly. 3 days later, I returned to the hospital as a visitor, not an employee. The badge I'd worn for over 2 decades was gone, but muscle memory guided me through the labyrinthine corridors. I knew every shortcut, every blind spot, every moment when the security cameras turned away. The medical records department occupied the 3rd floor's east wing, a maze of filing cabinets and computer terminals where the official version of patient care was stored and sanitized. During my tenure, I'd rarely ventured there. Nurses lived in the immediate world of patient care, not the abstract realm of documentation. Now documentation was everything. I found Jennifer Martinez at her desk, surrounded by towers of patient files. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with mechanical precision, entering data that would become the legal foundation for treatment decisions, insurance claims, and liability assessments. Jennifer had always been friendly during our brief encounters in the cafeteria, but now her smile seemed forced, her eyes darting nervously toward the supervisor's office. She gestured toward the visitor's chair without looking up from her screen. Her explanation came in practiced phrases, the kind of corporate speak designed to deflect rather than inform. My termination was unfortunate but necessary. The hospital's primary concern was patient safety. The decision had been thoroughly reviewed and found to be justified. But her hands told a different story. They shook slightly as she pulled up my employment record, trembled when she accessed the incident reports, and clenched into fists when she thought I wasn't looking. Whatever role she'd played in my destruction, it was eating at her. I mentioned the Hendricks case, the patient whose care had been central to my termination. An elderly man with diabetes who'd supposedly suffered complications due to my failure to monitor his blood sugar levels. The official record showed a clear pattern of negligence: missed checks, improper documentation, delayed interventions. Jennifer's screen flickered as she brought up Hendrick's file, and for just a moment I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The timestamp on the final entry was dated 3 days after my termination. She minimized the window before I could read more, but that single glimpse was enough. The evidence of my supposed negligence had been created retroactively, fabricated to justify a decision that had already been made. I left the hospital that day with a new understanding of the enemy I faced. This wasn't about one corrupt administrator or a single falsified report. This was a system, a machine designed to protect the institution at any cost, even if it meant destroying the people who dedicated their lives to its mission. But machines have weaknesses. They rely on patterns, protocols, and the assumption that their victims will accept defeat. I had no intention of accepting anything. The next phase required patience and precision. I couldn't simply walk back into the hospital and demand access to records. My termination had revoked those privileges. But 23 years of service had taught me that hospitals, like all complex organizations, functioned on relationships, routines, and the basic human tendency to trust familiar faces. I started with the night shift. Midnight brought a different energy to the hospital. The administrative offices were dark, the executive parking spaces empty, but the essential work continued. Nurses, technicians, and support staff moved through corridors lit by emergency lighting, their focus entirely on patient care rather than corporate politics. I arrived at 11:47 p.m., using the staff entrance that connected to the parking garage. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Rodriguez who'd worked the night shift for over a decade, looked up from his crossword puzzle with recognition rather than suspicion. My explanation was simple. I'd left some personal items in my old locker and just needed a few minutes to retrieve them. Rodriguez had seen this scenario countless times. Terminated employees returning for forgotten belongings, their professional lives reduced to the contents of a metal box. He handed me a temporary visitor's badge without checking the computer system, his trust in my familiar face overriding protocol. The badge would give me access to most areas of the hospital, including the medical records department. The third floor was virtually deserted at this hour. A single maintenance worker mopped the corridors, his earbuds blocking out the world as he worked. The medical records department was locked, but I knew the maintenance staff kept master keys on their utility belts. I waited until the janitor moved to the far end of the corridor, then approached from behind. The keys hung from a retractable cord, and years of nursing had taught me to work quickly and silently. The records room key was labeled with a small MR sticker, and it turned in the lock with a soft click. The department's computer terminals were protected by password screens, but physical files remained accessible. I found the section containing recent patient records, focusing on cases from the month before my termination. If the hospital was systematically falsifying records, there would be patterns, tells that would reveal the scope of their deception. The Hendricks file was thick, filled with daily nursing notes, physician orders, and lab results. I photographed each page with my phone, the camera's flash disabled to avoid detection. The official narrative was there, carefully constructed over dozens of pages, but inconsistencies emerged under close examination. Handwriting samples that didn't match the purported authors, medication dosages that violated standard protocols, timestamps that created impossible sequences of events, but the most damning evidence was hidden in the file's physical structure itself. Pages had been inserted out of sequence, their edges slightly misaligned with the original documents. Staple holes didn't match up where they should. Most tellingly, several pages showed evidence of whiteout and overwriting, crude attempts to alter information that had already been recorded. I found similar anomalies in a dozen other files, each one representing a case where the hospital had faced potential liability. The pattern was clear. When lawsuits or regulatory investigations threatened, patient records were retroactively modified to shift blame away from the institution and onto individual staff members. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just about my termination. It was about a systematic effort to rewrite medical history, to transform institutional failures into personal scapegoats. I photographed everything, building a digital archive of evidence that would expose the entire operation. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough. I needed proof of the falsification process itself, evidence that would be impossible to explain away or dismiss. That proof came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks into my investigation, I received a text message from an unknown number. The message contained only an address and a time: tomorrow, 2 p.m. St. Mary's Cemetery. The cemetery was a maze of weathered headstones and ancient oak trees, its paths winding through generations of the city's dead. I found the specified location, a bench overlooking the older section where marble angels kept eternal watch over forgotten names. Jennifer Martinez was waiting for me, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear. She wore civilian clothes and dark sunglasses, though the afternoon sun was filtered through heavy clouds. Her hands clutched a manila envelope so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She explained everything without prompting, her words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and terror. The falsification operation had been running for 3 years, orchestrated by Walsh and a small group of senior administrators. Patient records were routinely altered to protect the hospital from liability, with clerical staff like Jennifer forced to participate under threat of termination. The envelope contained printouts of the original records, the true documentation of patient care before it was modified to serve the hospital's legal interests. Jennifer had been secretly copying files for months, building her own insurance policy against the day when she might become the next scapegoat. My termination had been the final straw. The administrators had become so bold, so confident in their system, that they'd fabricated evidence against one of the hospital's most respected nurses. Jennifer couldn't stand by and watch an innocent person destroyed by the machine she'd helped to operate. The original Hendricks file told a completely different story than the version that had justified my firing. The elderly patient had indeed suffered complications, but they were the result of a systemic failure. Understaffing, inadequate equipment, and pressure to discharge patients too quickly to maximize bed turnover. My documentation had been thorough and accurate. The interventions I'd performed were appropriate and timely. The complications weren't preventable given the resources available, but the hospital needed someone to blame when the family threatened to sue. Jennifer's evidence was devastating, but it came with a warning. Walsh had grown suspicious of her activities, and she believed her own termination was imminent. She was planning to disappear, to relocate to another state where the hospital's influence couldn't reach her. I convinced her to wait. The next phase of my plan required her continued access to the record system, and I had an idea that would protect both of us while ensuring maximum damage to our enemies. Instead of simply exposing the falsification scheme, I would turn the hospital's own weapon against them. I would create a trap so elegant, so perfectly baited, that they would have no choice but to walk directly into it. The plan began with a phone call to the state medical board. I presented myself as a concerned citizen who had noticed discrepancies in medical records during a family member's treatment. I provided specific details about the Hendricks case, enough to trigger an investigation, but not enough to reveal the full scope of my knowledge. The medical board's investigation would follow predictable patterns. They would request patient records, interview staff members, and examine the hospital's documentation practices. Walsh and his conspirators would scramble to cover their tracks, but their efforts would only dig them deeper into the trap I was setting. Meanwhile, Jennifer began the delicate process of replacing altered records with their original versions. She worked slowly, carefully, changing just enough files to create an impossible situation for the hospital's administrators. When the medical board's investigators arrived, they would find a mixture of falsified and authentic records, a confusion that would raise immediate red flags about the hospital's documentation practices. The administrators would be forced to explain why some records appeared to be altered while others remained intact. But the true masterstroke was yet to come. I had Jennifer create a complete digital backup of the hospital's current record system, including all the falsified files. This backup would serve as irrefutable proof of the hospital's systematic deception, showing the exact nature and scope of the alterations. Then, I arranged for this backup to be discovered by the medical board's investigators in the most damaging way possible. The backup was stored on a server in Walsh's office, hidden in a folder labeled Legal Defense Materials. To an outside observer, it would appear that the hospital's director had been maintaining a secret archive of falsified records for use in defending against malpractice claims. When the investigators found this server, and they would, because I made sure they received an anonymous tip about its location, Walsh would be faced with an impossible choice. He could claim the backup was created by a rogue employee, but the files were stored in his personal directory and accessed using his administrative credentials. He could admit to the falsification scheme, but that would expose the entire conspiracy and destroy the hospital's reputation. Or he could try to explain away the evidence, a task that would require him to contradict his own previous statements and create an ever-expanding web of lies. The investigation proceeded exactly as I had predicted. The medical board's team arrived on a Tuesday morning, their presence sending ripples of panic through the hospital's administrative hierarchy. Walsh emerged from his office with the confident demeanor of a man who had weathered such inquiries before, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was watching. The investigators began with routine document requests, asking for patient files and staff records related to several cases, including Hendricks. Jennifer, following my instructions, provided a mixture of original and falsified records, creating exactly the kind of inconsistency that would trigger deeper scrutiny. By Thursday, the investigators had noticed the discrepancies. They called for additional documentation, requesting backup files and computer records that would show the complete history of each patient's care. Walsh's confidence began to crack as he realized the scope of what they were asking for. The breakthrough came on Friday afternoon. Acting on an anonymous tip, the investigators requested access to Walsh's office computer system. They found the backup server within hours, its contents revealing the full extent of the falsification operation. Hundreds of altered records, systematic patterns of deception, and most damaging of all, documentation showing how specific staff members had been targeted for termination when they became inconvenient. Walsh's attempt to explain the server's contents was pathetic. He claimed the backup was created by a disgruntled former employee, implying that I had somehow gained access to his personal computer system and planted evidence. But the timestamps on the files contradicted this story, showing that the backup had been maintained and updated over a period of months. The medical board suspended the hospital's license pending a full investigation. Local news outlets picked up the story, and within days, the scandal had exploded into a national controversy about healthcare fraud and patient safety. But I wasn't finished. The next phase of my revenge targeted the individual administrators who had orchestrated my destruction. Walsh was the primary target, but he hadn't acted alone. Deputy Director Sarah Chen had signed off on my termination paperwork. Human Resources Manager Robert Kim had conducted the sham investigation that justified my firing. Chief of Staff Dr. Patricia Williams had provided the medical cover for their actions. Each of them would pay for their role in the conspiracy. Chen's downfall came through her own greed. I discovered that she had been embezzling funds from the hospital's charity care program, using fake patient accounts to redirect money into her personal accounts. The evidence was hidden in financial records that only someone with extensive knowledge of the hospital's systems could have found. I provided this information to the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division, timing the revelation to coincide with the medical board's investigation. Chen was arrested at her home on a Tuesday morning, her fall from grace swift and humiliating. Kim's destruction was more personal. I had discovered his affair with a subordinate, a relationship that violated the hospital's ethics policies and created potential liability for sexual harassment claims. More importantly, I had evidence that he had used his position to manipulate the woman's performance reviews and salary increases. I didn't need to expose this information directly. Instead, I arranged for the woman's husband to discover the affair through a carefully orchestrated series of events. The resulting divorce proceedings would expose Kim's misconduct in public court filings, destroying his reputation and career. Dr. Williams presented a more complex challenge. As chief of staff, she had been careful to maintain plausible deniability regarding the records falsification scheme. Her signature appeared on documents, but always with enough ambiguity to claim she had been misled by subordinates. Her weakness was professional pride. Williams had built her career on a reputation for clinical excellence and ethical leadership. The revelation that she had overseen a systematic fraud operation would destroy everything she had worked to achieve, but simply exposing her involvement wouldn't be enough. I needed to force her to choose between her reputation and her freedom. The trap I set for Williams was elegant in its simplicity. I arranged for her to receive a patient complaint that would force her to either admit her knowledge of the falsification scheme or perjure herself in sworn testimony. The complaint came from the family of a patient who had died under suspicious circumstances. The official medical record showed that appropriate care had been provided, but the family had obtained an independent medical review that contradicted the hospital's version of events. Williams was required to provide a sworn deposition defending the hospital's care, but she faced an impossible choice. If she testified that the medical records were accurate, she would be committing perjury. The independent review had conclusively shown that key portions of the record had been falsified. If she admitted that the records might be inaccurate, she would be acknowledging the falsification scheme and implicating herself in a conspiracy. She chose perjury. The deposition took place on a cold Thursday morning in the offices of the plaintiff's attorney. Williams sat across from a video camera, her hand raised as she swore to tell the truth. Her testimony was confident, authoritative, and completely contradicted by the evidence I had provided to the opposing counsel. When the perjury charges were filed 2 weeks later, Williams's legal team tried to claim she had been misled by subordinates. But the evidence showed that she had been actively involved in reviewing and approving the falsified records, her signature appearing on documents that created the false narrative. The final phase of my revenge was the most satisfying. Walsh had managed to avoid criminal charges by claiming he had been manipulated by subordinates and outside consultants. His testimony painted him as a well-intentioned administrator who had been deceived by a conspiracy he didn't understand. But I had one final card to play. During my investigation, I had discovered that Walsh had been selling the hospital's patient information to pharmaceutical companies and insurance providers. The scheme was sophisticated, involving shell companies and offshore accounts, but the evidence was conclusive. This wasn't just healthcare fraud, it was a violation of federal privacy laws that carried severe criminal penalties. More importantly, it was something Walsh had done personally, without subordinates or accomplices who could share the blame. I provided this evidence to federal prosecutors through a carefully orchestrated leak to investigative reporters. The story broke on a Sunday morning, dominating the news cycle and making Walsh's other defenses irrelevant. He was arrested at his home that Tuesday, led away in handcuffs as news cameras captured his fall from grace. The man who had destroyed my career with fabricated evidence was now facing decades in federal prison for crimes I had uncovered through patient investigation. The hospital itself didn't survive the scandal. Within 6 months, the state had revoked its license, and the facility was sold to a healthcare corporation that fired the entire administrative staff and implemented new oversight procedures. But my revenge wasn't complete until I had reclaimed my own reputation. The medical board's investigation had cleared me of all charges, finding that the evidence against me had been fabricated and that my termination was unjustified. I was offered reinstatement with full back pay and benefits, but I declined. Instead, I used the evidence from my investigation to file a comprehensive lawsuit against the hospital, its administrators, and the healthcare system that had enabled their fraud. The settlement was substantial, enough to ensure that I would never need to work again if I chose not to. But more importantly, the lawsuit established a legal precedent that would make it harder for other healthcare institutions to engage in similar fraud. The case became a textbook example of how systematic deception could be exposed and punished, studied in law schools and medical ethics programs across the country. 6 months after my termination, I stood in the parking garage where my professional destruction had begun. The hospital that had cast me out was now empty, its windows dark, its parking lot overgrown with weeds. The building would be demolished within the year, but the lesson it taught would endure. I had proven that no institution, no matter how powerful or well-protected, could survive the consequences of its own corruption when confronted by someone with the knowledge, patience, and determination to expose the truth. The satisfaction I felt wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about justice served with surgical precision, administered by someone who understood the system well enough to turn its own weapons against it. As I drove away from the empty hospital for the final time, I reflected on the price of my victory. My career in nursing was over, my trust in healthcare institutions permanently shattered. But in exchange, I had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that truth, properly wielded, was more powerful than any conspiracy. The administrators who had destroyed my career were now facing their own professional and personal ruin. The system that had protected them had been dismantled and rebuilt with new safeguards. Most importantly, patients would be safer because the corruption had been exposed and eliminated. I was a nurse fired for negligence until I exposed the hospital's fake medical records. In the end, the only thing fake was the evidence they had used to destroy me. The truth, as I had learned, was far more powerful than any lie they could construct. And sometimes the truth is the most devastating weapon of all.